We now have an accurate picture of the infrastructure gap facing First Nations, and the numbers are truly vile. $350 billion. This is First Nations like Shamattawa facing a housing crisis. It's the long-term boil water advisory in Pucketawagan and 27 other First Nations. It's crumbling schools like the one in Tatasquiat Cree Nation. It's the forced isolation of communities like Wasagamak and Pungasi who desperately need an airport. It's unacceptable, but what's this government's solution? Cuts to Indigenous services. Why are the Liberals punishing First Nations for Liberal failures? The NDP have pushed the Liberal government, as my colleague pointed out, to invest in urban Indigenous housing, northern housing. But we've also been very clear that the Liberal government is nowhere near where it needs to be when it comes to investing in First Nations housing, on reserve housing. Many of the First Nations I represent face an acute housing crisis. I would say all of the First Nations face a housing crisis. For remote communities, it is particularly acute. We're talking about overcrowded housing, moldy homes. We're talking about absolutely inadequate housing. And we know that successive Liberal and Conservative governments have failed First Nations when it comes to housing. We know that the current Liberal government loves to talk about reconciliation. Reconciliation ought to mean investing in housing and addressing the housing crisis on First Nations.
The NDP successfully fought against cuts to Indigenous services, but it's clear the Liberals still don't get it. Let's look at housing and infrastructure, where the Liberals spent less than 1% of what First Nations need. First Nations here in Manitoba face a serious infrastructure crisis, but this government still delays helping them, preferring to pat themselves on the back for just not being conservatives. Will the Liberals commit to partner with Manitoba First Nations to build the infrastructure they desperately need, including on the airport in Wasagamak and the desperately needed East Side All-Weather Road?